Okay, so let's talk about video games for a second. And I know what you're probably thinking, what do you know about video games? And to be fair, the only video game I ever really play is Just to Impress on Roblox. But even a cute, silly little game that 8-year-old girls play has a lot of the same issues that more mainstream games have. So first, let's talk about something that's not exactly new in the video game world. These popular phrases that we hear all the time. Phrases like sex sells, or it's just a game, or if you don't like it, don't play it. I've read plenty of these types of comments on Reddit and even online discussions in general, especially when talking about the over-sexualization of women and female characters in video games. So here's the thing, they aren't just random phrases, they're what we call commonplaces. Basically, they're in-group beliefs held to be true in a community, like inside jokes, but way less fun. And in the context of video games culture, they're often used as justification for the sexualization of female characters in video games. These phrases are commonplaces because they reinforce a shared negative mindset in the gaming community that this issue of sexualization is acceptable. So why are these commonplaces dangerous? Well, Jay Heinrichs talks about how commonplaces are carefully chosen to trigger a good response from the audience. The issue with these phrases isn't just that they're repeated so often in online discourse, but it's that they diminish the harmful impact of sexualization. They imply that this is just how things are and that it's harmless or even natural. Let's get into specifics. Even in a game as innocent and lighthearted as Dress to Impress has its issues. So the game constantly pushes out fun updates that keep players interested in the game. But something that you may not have noticed is that from the game's layout and aesthetics when it first came out in November 2023 to the aesthetics now in 2024, the clothes have updated to increasingly show more skin on the default female models and more prominent cleavage. You may be thinking that it's just a fashion game, so obviously it's going to show skin in its clothes. But even though it's just a kid's game that lets them play dress up in cute clothes, that doesn't mean it doesn't have real-life implications that can be harmful to young players. Simon Engenfeld says that game aesthetics actively shape players' perceptions of the world. This means that when games use aesthetics that sexualize women or show revealing clothing, they implicitly communicate messages about gender, beauty, and even attractiveness. Games reinforce the ways players engage with and interpret these ideas, which can make young players think that the sexualization of female bodies is standard or even normalized. But Dress to Impress is hardly the most prevalent example of sexualization of female characters in video games. There are way more popular games that overtly sexualize women. For example, Soul Calibur and Mortal Kombat. These games show female characters wearing extremely revealing and form-fitting clothes and as having over-exaggerated body features. Not only are these clothes and bodies already highly sexualized in and of itself, but the intentional choice to feature these revealing clothing on female characters in impractical settings like the Arctic tundra is absurd. This just draws attention to the sexualization of female characters because they're showcased as sexual spectacles rather than practical fighting opponents in these combat games. And this can actually have some pretty negative consequences, especially when you think about toxic masculinity and how it can be perpetuated through these game aesthetics. When these games portray their female characters as objects that are really only in the game for the sexual aesthetic, they can reinforce the idea that women only exist to satisfy sexual desires or enhance the experience of male players. Mortal Kombat even takes it a step further and showcases certain female characters performing seductive moves and poses both during and after combat. So there's this idea in gaming called the magic circle, according to Johan Huizinga. It's basically this idea that what happens in the game stays in the game. So what this means in video games is that they create a magic circle that serves as a form of escapism, where players feel as if their decisions in the game have no real-world consequences. But this magic circle can be dangerous because if players sexualize women in video games, what's to say it won't stop at video games? What's to say it won't spread into their real-life interactions and thoughts? Miguel Sicart actually has a better take on this. He says that games aren't just an escape. They actually influence our morals and how we see the world. So when we see highly sexualized characters in games, that image sticks. It doesn't just disappear when we turn off the game. So while games might feel like an escape, they actually shape our reality instead. And this ties into the idea that even in video games, virtual bodies exist and consequently do things, according to Obreja. This means that bodies, even though they are virtual, are important in shaping meaning and they influence how players interact with the game. But sometimes the problem isn't even the game design, it's the players. Back to Dress to Impress, some players purposefully sexualize the themes in the game to create inappropriate costumes or outfits. Recently, the game developers had to remove a hot dog Halloween costume and replace it with a cupcake because so many players were changing the colors on the hot dog to make it look like something very inappropriate. So you're probably thinking that this is just an issue in a few servers where only a small number of players sexualize the game. But I'll tell you why it's deeper than just that. But first, we have to think about what game dynamics even are. Engenfeld describes game dynamics as functions of the mechanics that are surprising and cannot always be predicted. The fact that game dynamics are surprising and unintentional demonstrates how the wider social effects of games are completely dependent on the players' interactions and perceptions of the game. This goes to show how the social impact of games emerges from the interaction between player behavior and game design, rather than solely the design itself. So when players create purposefully sexualized outfits in Dress to Impress, this reveals how social norms and ideas penetrate the video game space, and how the social impact of games is something that is created by the players. So while this hot dog costume comes across as just a silly little outfit, it teaches young players that making jokes at the expense of women's bodies or even distorting women's bodies for comedic effect is acceptable. Another example of game dynamics is The Sims. There are mods that players are able to download that allow their characters to say inappropriate things or engage in sexual activity in the game. This just goes to show how players have agency and actively aim to sexualize certain games. It parallels the desire to subvert the innocent, family-friendly style of Dress to Impress as well. Another game that I think actually has clearer implications and worse consequences of sexualization is Fortnite. In 2018, Fortnite accidentally released an update that featured accurate, let's just say physics, of a female character's breasts when the player moved or jumped. Yeah, they called it an accident. But the physics of this character wouldn't have been an issue if players weren't trying to find something to sexualize about the character. Players would make the character jump or perform certain moves that would accentuate the physics of her body. In another instance was when Fortnite had to change certain emotes based on the gender that was doing the emotes. In other words, while male characters could perform the dances as they were originally designed, Fortnite altered its female characters' movements to avoid sexualizing their bodies. This just shows that the game is aware that players purposefully use these emotes and dances to inappropriately view female characters in a sexual way. This just shows how harmful game dynamics can truly be. Because players have agency in their decision making, video games are a lot more interactive than other passive forms of media like watching TV. So because of this, sexualized content in video games can increase aggressive thoughts and behaviors towards women, according to Bernay, Bushman, and Leroy. At the end of the day, video games are huge. Millions of people play video games. That's why it's important to call out these issues, because if we don't, the sexualization of women in games will only continue to warp social perceptions of women and create a culture of objectification and toxic masculinity. Lastly, I want to end on Sicart. He critiques Huizinga's idea that play is all about competition and dominance. Instead, he suggests that play should be more inclusive, interactive, and collaborative. And this is exactly how we need to talk about rhetorics of sexuality in video games moving on in the future. In a world where games have the power to influence so much, this shift could lead to a healthier and more understanding game culture for all players.